I'm Jamie Kabler, the founder of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. And I want to welcome you to our first virtual reality Writers Festival event. I want to start off by thanking the City Council of Rancho Mirage and the city manager, Isaiah Hageman, for running the best run city in California, particularly in these hard days. And then I want to thank the staff and Erin Espinoza, the head of our library, for doing a great job for today's event. Our distinguished guest today is Ambassador John Bolton. John has served in the government, in and out of the government for most of his life. In 2005 and 2006, he was our American ambassador to the United Nations. And most recently, in 2018 and 2019, he was a national security advisor to President Trump. I'm very proud that this book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House Memoir, is this week #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, we've purchased 1,000 of these books so that every reader and angel in support of the Writers Festival will get a free copy of this book. And I'm very excited about that. And now, Douglas Brinkley is a distinguished CNN presidential historian. My favorite book was his book last year, American Moonshot. And Doug will be interviewing Ambassador Bolton. And so I now want to welcome two distinguished guests, Ambassador John Bolton and Douglas Brinkley.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for having us here. I hope you hear me all right. Can you hear me fine? And Ambassador Bolton, what an honor. Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy your time with the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. It's really the premier festival of books in the United States, and it'll be a little different interview than you get on the TV news shows. We're really interested in talking about your book.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Glad to be with you, even if only virtually.
Yeah, we'll do this virtually. And I have your book and read it. It's a wonderful read, The Room Where It Happened. And as congratulations on being #1 on the New York Times. I wanted to start by just mentioning in the epilogue where you write, and it's at the back of the book, that as if impeachment were not enough, I also found myself confronting the daunting challenge of fighting an incumbent president determined to prevent publication of a book about my White House experience. You say Trump behaved typically, directing the seizure and withholding of my advisor's personal and other unclassified documents despite numerous requests for their return, obstructing my Twitter account, and making outright threats of censorship. His reaction thus ranged from the mean-spirited to the constitutionally impermissible. My reaction, my response, you said, game on. So let's game on with that. How did it feel to have a president of the United States trying to obstruct your book?
Well, it was an experience I think probably nobody wants to go through, but it's fairly typical for the way Donald Trump behaves. When he hears information that he doesn't like, that doesn't fit into his preconception, he tries to strike it from consciousness. And I think that's the approach he had with my book. It's not that he feared foreign governments reading about secrets that I was releasing. He feared the American people reading it. And you know, I don't feel alone in that regard. If you ask his niece, who has just gone through a similar experience with her book, it's an approach that he takes. I would think he would understand it's self-defeating. The publisher loves the publicity, but you know, that's the way he is. He does not want to hear things that don't conform to his view.
Do you think he's read your book?
No, he's not a big reader to begin with. I think he's been briefed on it. I think he has said that. I'm sure that's correct. They may have shown him particular passages. Jared Kushner may have read it. Others certainly have, but I don't think he ever will read it.
You ever imagine yourself, Mr. Ambassador, talking about a president of the United States and saying that they're not a big reader? And in fact, I once talked to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago myself, asked him about what presidential books he's read, and he told me none. And I said, even a children's book on Lincoln or something in your life? And he said, no, I really get my information off of television and you know, recent presidents, and I'm a student of that, and I'm just not a big reader. How has that hurt Donald Trump, do you think? He seems to have no sense of our nation's past in any real way.
Yeah. Well, you've covered a bunch of subjects there, all of which were important. And I do think every president, every individual takes in information in different ways. Some people absorb it better in one way than another. And you know, if they've proven successful in life, then who's really to criticize? Personally, I'm a reader. People talk about intelligence briefs. I would have it all written down. If I had questions, I'd ask them. I didn't need somebody to tell me what I could read more efficiently. But that's a matter of style and approach. The real factor here, I think, is that Trump didn't come to the presidency with a great base of information on the subjects he was going to have to deal with. No president comes with 360-degree comprehensive knowledge. But any successful president is going to recognize that he doesn't know what he doesn't know and is going to learn what he feels is necessary. I just don't think Trump is interested in learning. It's true about historical information, at least that was my experience. It's true about current information that we get from our intelligence, from our allies and friends. He just doesn't feel the need to have a larger and larger information base. I think it's part and parcel that he doesn't feel the need to prepare for meetings. He thinks he can operate on the basis of gut. He believes it's been successful in his business career. Let others be the judge of that. It's not the way to be successful as president.
Does President Trump have a sense of humor? Did you ever?
Yes, I think he does. I mean, I think it would be wrong to try and characterize him as not having a sense of humor, but it's certainly rarely about himself. It's usually at the expense of other people. But yes, he is able to laugh. It's not a predominant characteristic, but it's not completely absent.
What did you think, Mr. Ambassador? I mean, here you have Donald Trump's constantly supporting a political base, and he supports it. They'll support Donald Trump regardless of his behavior. What kind of movement is that, where you have a president that really can do or say anything? It could be misogynistic, racist, divisive. It could be against America's interest abroad. But this, let's call it 35% of the voting public adoringly stays in lockstep with him.
Yeah, I think it's motivated in part by who his opponents are. On the left side of the political spectrum, you can call it that way, they react to Trump's criticism of those who criticize the people who are in his base. But one of the reasons I wrote the book was I felt it was extremely important. Everybody can judge the book, they'll make up their own mind, but extremely important to demonstrate that Trump doesn't have a philosophy. He's not a conservative Republican. I don't mean by that to say he's a liberal Democrat. He's not that either. He's nothing philosophically. Nor does he approach presidential decision-making from the perspective of a grand strategy he's built up over the years. He doesn't even really follow individual policies with consistency. And that's the reason I believe that after this November, whether he wins or loses, there will be a big struggle for the future of the Republican Party. If he loses, obviously that struggle will begin immediately. But even if he wins, in a way, he's a lame duck already. The 2024 election has already begun. I personally think this is going to be critical to reestablishing the Republican Party as the party of Ronald Reagan. I'm not myself looking for purity here in philosophical terms. What I want to do is cut this albatross from around the neck of the party, because even if he wins, it could be a very bad event for the party as a whole, a Pyrrhic victory that Trump personally may win, but may do irreparable damage to the party. So we've got to take that into account. The party should not be fixated on one individual, especially one who doesn't have a governing philosophy.
You mentioned in the book, and I had never thought of this before, but if Trump did get reelected, he would be then running for legacy, and he might end up wanting to do something with Democrats, infrastructure, perhaps, to try to build a second term legacy. That might not be part of what the conservative movement's agenda is. We really don't know what a second term Trump would look like. But are you worried if he got reelected that his authoritarian streak could run amok, that he would feel above the law?
You know, I couldn't point to specific evidence on that score, but I can certainly, and I have a few quotes in the book really dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, where he says things that no conservative Republican would have accepted before he became president. For example, where he says, my authority over the governors is absolute. That's the way it has to be. Well, no, it's not. And it's frightening that anybody could have somehow put in his head the idea that the Constitution gave him that authority. It's an example of not having a philosophy. What I think I show in a number of incidents in the book is that his decisions in the national security space typically don't come because he's persuaded about the merits of this policy versus that policy. They come because he fears the domestic political ramification if he doesn't adopt a certain view. And that's what gets me worried about a second term, is that with that guide rail eliminated, with the no need to go back to the political base, there's really no telling what he's going to do.
You know, you early on in the book, you remind us of your career. You're graduate of Yale University, lived in Maryland, but an early hero of yours was Barry Goldwater. Do you consider yourself, this late, it's 2020, do you find yourself, are you willing to call yourself a Barry Goldwater Republican?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of people in the baby boom generation on the conservative side, that was my first political involvement. I think it led directly to the Republican Party becoming a really conservative party. And I think you can trace a direct line from 1964 to Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, through Watergate, through the collapse of the Nixon presidency. When Reagan appeared, and his first appearance in Republican politics was to give a speech for Barry Goldwater late in the 64 campaign, that really got a lot of people started. And I think Reagan was you might say, a more mature spokesman for the same point of view, and but articulated many of the same principles in a way that was more attractive and more appealing.
Goldwater, however, had that famous moment during Watergate with Nixon, where he told Nixon, "You lied to me, you lied to the American people," and Goldwater wanted nothing to do with Nixon. Have you had that moment with Donald Trump with the publication of this book? Did Goldwater, in your mind, that Goldwater stood up to a fellow Republican and said, "I've had it with you"? Did that play into any of your thinking in writing this book?
Well, certainly I was aware of that. And, you know, there's been a lot of controversy over why I didn't testify in the impeachment proceedings. And I discussed this in the book. And the short answer is because I think the Democrats committed impeachment malpractice. It was precisely the Watergate scandal where Democrats did reach out to Republicans, where there was an effort to work together. And while they didn't go all the way through the constitutional process, obviously Nixon resigned. And it's just a fact. It's a fact of arithmetic. You can't remove a sitting president without 2/3 of the Senate, and that means a lot of people from the other party. So just as Republicans couldn't get Clinton out in the 1990s, the Democrats were doomed to failure given the approach they had here. And I remembered at the time that the first Republican senator to call for Nixon to resign was Jim Buckley, who wasn't even a Republican. He was a conservative party candidate in New York. But when Republicans went to the White House, a small delegation of Republican senators, you're quite right, it was Barry Goldwater who basically led that meeting. And when Nixon realized Goldwater was against him, that was the end right there.
So at this point in time, you know, your impeachment malpractice, of course, has angered Democrats, and so that you're a pariah figure with most Democratic figures. you're persona non grata with the Trump administration. I mean, the president tweeted such horrific things about you and turning people off against you. So you are on a kind of a conservative island of your own right now, but you seem unwilling to join something like the Lincoln Project that, McCain's former campaign manager, Weaver, has, created of a real conservative intellectual with values, which and an honorable person like you are, saying, look, I'm a Republican and conservative, but I can't vote for Donald Trump because of he's unfit for command due to his character. Are you willing to join a group like the Lincoln Project, and say, I'm a conservative, but I cannot vote for Donald Trump?
Well, what I have said is I'm going to write in the name of a to be determined conservative leader. Look, in 2016, I faced this same question, obviously, as many people did, and I voted for Trump in 2016. And I was persuaded by the argument that one of the two of them, Hillary Clinton or Trump, will win. You got to vote for one or the other, and I did. I'm not convinced of it after having worked for 17 months for Trump in good conscience. I just cannot vote for him. But philosophically, I'm not going to vote for Biden either. I respect that some Republicans are going to vote for Biden. That's up to them. That's not what I'm going to do. I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of people who I think feel the same way I do, and they're going to fracture in a lot of different ways. A lot of them will vote for Trump, notwithstanding they say they agree with me on a lot of things. But I think a lot of Republicans will either stay home at the presidential level or write in somebody as well. And that goes to the point we discussed earlier, why there will be a big conversation about the future of the party. I think that's absolutely critical. And the effect that Trump has had on the party is hard to describe, but it certainly includes intimidating people. And torquing not just within the party, but really the entire American political system around the question, do you like Donald Trump or do you not? That's not right in a democracy. We should have competing interests, competing ideas, competing personalities. But you do verge into a danger zone when loyalty to a person, no matter what he says, becomes the touchstone. I just emphatically reject that.
But you don't reject the idea of being connected to a party. You've mentioned a number of times in our talk already, the Republican Party is part of your DNA. Well, what is it about Biden that you couldn't vote for him? And is there something Biden could do that could woo you over? Is there an aspect of his career that you're worried about in, let's say, the foreign policy realm that you think would be very dangerous for the country, and it gives you a reason? Because he might be a placeholder after Trump. A Biden administration could be like Jerry Ford, after the fall of Nixon. Somebody who's pretty likable, might pull the country together. What prevents you from being able to vote for Biden?
Well, it is a philosophical disagreement. I have no criticism of Joe Biden, the person. He and I have been involved in different political struggles over the years in the foreign affairs area, when he was on the Judiciary Committee, on judicial nominations, on a range of things. So I've had a lot of dealings with him. That forms no part of my reluctance to vote for him. It is philosophical. And I got involved in politics at the beginning for philosophical reasons. And I just think it's better to be consistent on the philosophical track. People say, but you're throwing your vote away. Again, that's not exactly true. I mean, if you're a Trump voter in 2016 and you don't vote for him in 2020, that's one less vote he gets. Now, if I voted for Biden, that would be one more vote he got, but it's not like it's a completely insignificant fact not to vote for Trump. And I'm not looking to persuade others to do that necessarily. I understand why good faith people can vote for Biden who have been Republicans during their political activity as well. And I think they ought to be welcomed back to the discussion about where the party goes after the election.
Who is a Republican lawmaker, perhaps U.S. Senator might be the best, that you really respect, that somebody that John Bolton sees them working in the Senate and the Republican side, and you say that's the kind of man or woman who should be president?
Well, I don't want to get any of them in trouble by naming them. They don't need a 2-minute hate from the Donald Trump Twitter feed any more than anybody else does. But there are a number of them, and some of them I think will run in 2024. I wish they were speaking up more now, and I think those who have spoken up, I respect them even where I disagree on some other aspects. But I don't think we have seen, at least in our lifetime, the kind of polarizing figure that Donald Trump is. And I think it took a lot of people unaware. And I'm not sure that lots of people are terribly proud about how they reacted to it one way or the other. And that will be part of our discussion as well. What do we do if we see somebody else like this emerging who has caused the country an enormous amount of damage in his first term, and why I don't think he deserves a second term?
The language that Trump used when he tweeted against you, basically, calling you a sicko and, this sort, I mean, how does that sting? How does that hurt you? How does one absorb being mauled on a tweet by the President of the United States?
Well, I'd certainly seen plenty of other people get the same treatment. I knew it was coming. Just as I think I went into the administration not from a naive perspective. When I wrote the book, I also knew what was coming. I knew the Democrats weren't going to like what I had done on impeachment. I knew a lot of Republicans wouldn't like what I said about Trump, and I certainly knew what Trump felt. And look, there were times writing the book I said, why am I going to go through this? What really is the point here? And the point is that the book, it will have an effect now. It's 4 months from the election. People will read it and what they say. But on the other hand, when the air is cleared and people are gone after 50 years, the book will still be there. And so the momentary turmoil that it creates, I was prepared for. I'm not saying it was fun, but I was prepared for it. And I had a larger, longer-term objective in mind.
Well, and that worked for a historian like myself. I like the detail and minutia in the book. I know some of the reviewers say, could dispense of it, but actually it's some of the most valuable material in the book to be footnoted when people try to reconstruct the Trump years further down the line. So I'm glad you did that approach with that amount of detail in the narrative. Let's switch, if we could, to some, which is right up your wheelhouse, U.S. foreign policy. And let's start with Russia. I mean, what cost is it to the United States of not having President Trump not say a single word to Vladimir Putin in this bounty gate, if it's true? What would you advise we do, the president do? Put your national security advisor cap back on. What should we have done with hearing about this bounty gate?
Well, I find it really hard to believe that Trump at some level was not briefed on this in the past couple of months. No intelligence is ever 100% verified. There are a lot of different factors that go into assessing what intelligence is worth, what you do with it. And all of it is distributed along a spectrum of uncertainty. There's no question about that. But if I were still at the White House, I at least would have gone into the president and said, look, heads up, Mr. President, we can't be absolutely sure of this. We're still checking it out. But this would reflect a change in Russian behavior, not simply from supporting the Taliban in ways we had known about for several years, but providing resources on condition that they kill Americans. That is a step up. That is more serious. It's not just more Russian assistance. And it should have affected what we were doing in Afghanistan and how we dealt with the Russians. That obviously didn't happen. If he was briefed, he didn't take it in. He didn't change behavior. Why? How can you explain that? I think in part because he has been pursuing, as I talk about toward the end of my tenure, this deal with the Taliban. Now, in fact, the deal is coming apart at the seams. It wasn't a good deal. His objectives were not sound. I think it's contrary to our national interest. But if he said, and here's another reason it's coming apart because the Russians are involved, it would have jeopardized the deal further, and people would have said, as you just asked, well, what are you going to do about the Russians? And the answer is he doesn't want to do much because he doesn't want to damage the relationship with Vladimir Putin.
Why? What is this? The big mystery of our time is this Trump-Putin alliance. What is the cement that holds that together? It often seems that the President of the United States is beholden or even acts like a puppet towards Vladimir Putin. What's the grist of that? Why is that happening to us?
I honestly can't say I saw any evidence that would indicate Trump was beholden to Putin for any reason. And I'm not a shrink like his niece, so I'm not making psychoanalytic evaluations. I think in a way it was akin to his unwillingness to admit there was Russian interference in the 2016 election at all because of the Russia collusion allegations. He was worried that if he said that the Russians had interfered, he would in a way be admitting somehow that his victory was not legitimate. So is he just irritating his critics by cozying up to Putin? Maybe that's a part of it. I think there is a larger pattern, which others have observed, that he gets on very well with authoritarian leaders, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Recep Erdogan of Turkey. He's never met Maduro, but he clearly wants to meet Maduro of Venezuela, whereas he doesn't get along so well with leaders of our allies. As we were departing for meetings in Europe in early 2018, shortly after I took the job, we were going to a NATO summit in Brussels, Prime Minister Theresa May in London, and then the famous Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin. And he said to the press, I think the meeting with Putin may be the easiest of all. Who would have thought it? And the answer is nobody would have thought it except him. It's hard to explain what that affinity is about, but he can't be beholden to all of them. I personally think it's, he likes the swagger of the authoritarian leader. They dispense justice. They dismiss due process. They make the shots. They don't have pesky advisors bothering them all the time or a Congress they have to deal with. And it's fun just to be able to make up your own mind and have something done. And he liked to show he was a big guy too.
In your book, you say that Condoleezza Rice told you that Putin governs by humiliation and propaganda. Does that sound like Donald Trump also?
Well, I don't think he governs in the same sense that Putin governs. I think Putin knows what he's doing in Russia. This guy is a hard man. He's one of the hard men of history, former KGB official. Trump isn't governing for a purpose other than Donald Trump. And that's one reason why I think some of the criticisms of Trump are overblown. If I thought he had a real purpose in mind, I would be a lot more worried. But I think he just likes being in the center of the biggest center of attention in the world.
You've had such a storied career. I take it now, we build these presidential libraries. You're not going to be a loved figure in the Trump library. I know you have a great career with the American Enterprise Institute, Yale University, but you seem to me to be part of Ronald Reagan's orbit. It seems to me that you are a Reaganite at heart, and in your mind, Reagan was the great president of your lifetime. Is that correct?
No, I would say I think that's right. I think it was a sea change in American politics, a sea change in how we approached government thereafter. We may be going through another sea change now in the wrong direction. I hope not, but I fear that Trump is part of the problem. He is not a Reagan Republican. It's not that he's some other kind of Republican, but he's certainly not a descendant politically of Ronald Reagan. And I'm worried that's going to cause a lot of damage, not just to the party we've talked about, but to the country, really.
What's their difference? Can we say that John Bolton's been educated by Donald Trump in the sense of the danger of electing a president on personality that has no real ideology, and also does not have a first-class temperament like FDR or this sort of avuncular nature of Ronald Reagan that could show the public the decency and kindness of an American president as a figurehead. Trump comes in a very stark figure in these ways. Is there a warning for future generations to be careful of making sure that character matters?
No, no, absolutely. And, I think looking back at 2016, at the beginning of the Republican nomination process, the number of people who thought Trump would get the nomination was somewhere around zero. I'm not even sure he thought he was going to get the nomination. And yet, by persistence and by the good luck of some of the candidates who were opposing him and a variety of factors, the anger and animosity among many of the voters, obviously he got the nomination, and against all odds, against everybody saying we were going to be wrapped up by about 8:30 on election night in 2016, and he won then too. So I think you've picked a good word. I think it was an education for me to see him up close for 17 months, and I hope I convey some of that experience to others in the book. And I do think it's very dangerous. I think character matters. I was certainly brought up by my parents to think that you had to be responsible to yourself, as the saying goes, even when no one else was watching. And I don't think that's where Donald Trump came out.
Yeah, and you write in the book about it when you first got into the Trump White House. First time you're photographed there, and then you're seeing it was kind of like a fraternity or a college dormitory atmosphere that you encountered. But then you got to see and know these players better, and you've come up with different critiques of many of the people in the book. But one that I'm not sure how you feel, because you say sort of nice things about him, but you don't really profile him, and that's Vice President Pence. How was it working with the Vice President?
Well, I knew him before I took the job. I knew him when he was in the House, and of course he went off to be governor of Indiana. I do think he's a man of real character, and it's a very hard job to be vice president. Unlike the other advisors, he really can't resign at any point, and he can only be fired at the end of 4 years. He was elected just as the president was. So I think the successful vice presidents in recent history have been those who spent a lot of their influence behind the scenes, basically one-on-one with the president. And I think Vice President Pence did a lot of that. I think there's a lot we may never really fully know or appreciate. That comes with its own cost for him. But I do think he's done a fantastic job for the country. And because a lot of it was when I was not in the room, and nor was anybody else other than he and the president, that's just lost, at least to my history.
I'm going to name some other figures. What about Melania Trump? Did you get to interact with her or see how she behaves as First Lady?
Well, not that much, really. I did describe in the book one incident where her staff went after my deputy national security advisor. I won't get into the bureaucracy, but her name was Mira Ricardel. She was my number two. Very experienced in Defense Department matters, former executive of Boeing. Smart, tough, just exactly what you want in a deputy to help you out. And somehow trying to help on a trip that the First Lady was taking to Africa to try and protect against mistakes and embarrassments, she crossed swords with the First Lady's staff. And the First Lady got her fired. And it was stunning to me, stunning. Never experienced anything like that. But it was done very effectively. She tweeted before she even told the president that she wanted her removed. And, it was a great loss for the American people. Mira went off and didn't want to stay in the government, went into the private sector again. I've never seen a First Lady do anything like that. Even Hillary Clinton, who she and her husband were a year ahead of me in law school, so I've known him a long time, not as close friends, but I've known him for a long time. Nobody even said ever anything like that, even about Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Is there a point where you recognize why in the world did you become national security advisor for this president? Did you have a light bulb moment when you realized, whether it was this event with the First Lady interfering like that? Or was there a moment when you said, this is not a good place for me to be? When did that occur to you?
Well, frequently, and starting very early. There was a flap people may remember where I said what we're looking for with respect to North Korea's nuclear weapons program was the Libya model of 2003, 2004. And by that, I meant a strategic decision by the North Koreans to give up their program, which they've never made. Not to this day have they made it. And Kim Jong-un was very displeased with that. He was displeased with the vice president. And at some point, I thought I was just going to get cut out of North Korean decision-making. And I told John Kelly, who was then the chief of staff, if that happens, then I'm leaving. And this is maybe a month, six weeks into the job. Kelly told me, and I recount this in the book, well, sort of join the club. That's how I feel every day when I come in here. And it goes to a hard question a lot of people have put to me, well, why did you stay? And the answer is because I thought I could still get the right thing done. Some people have said I should have resigned after about a week. Others have told me, you should never have resigned. You should have stayed as long as you could. All I can say is it was a hard personal decision to make. I know it was a hard personal decision for others too. It's hard if you haven't been in that position to put yourself in the shoes of people, but that's a calculus that each individual makes for himself.
So do you regret working for Trump? If you could do it again, would you have stayed out of that briar patch?
No, I don't think so. Number one, I don't second guess my former decisions a lot. I try and write about them, and then other people can second guess them for me. But I felt the country was facing a lot of threats and challenges. I think actually they're worse today than, in many respects, than they were 4 years ago. It's an honor always to serve, and especially to serve at a high level. And if you think you can make a contribution, I think you ought to put yourself forward.
China. Are you worried about China interfering in this election coming up in 2020? And how should we be dealing with China differently than we are right now?
Well, I think China is almost certainly trying to interfere in the election already. The vice president gave a speech last year, a very important speech about China's effort not simply to affect our elections, but to affect the overall political discourse in the country through a variety of ways. A very comprehensive speech that laid out a lot of what China was up to. With respect to the election, Russia will also be trying to interfere, probably Iran, North Korea. We've taken a lot of steps that should help us in cyberspace and in a variety of other areas. But I think the broad question of U.S. relations with China really are the existential question of the 21st century in international terms. I think our policy for the past 40 years on China has rested on two premises that have turned out to be untrue. Number one, increased wealth in China that came when it abandoned Marxism and adopted some market principles. Increased wealth did not make China a more responsible actor internationally. They're not a responsible stakeholder. They're not engaged in a peaceful rise. They are engaged in stealing our intellectual property, forced technology transfer, weaponizing companies like Huawei and ZTE. It's a long list. So the increased wealth of the Deng Xiaoping reforms did not make China more responsible, number one. That premise was wrong. Premise number two, that same increase in wealth did not contribute to China becoming a more democratic society. People said, well, there are real elections off in small villages in remote provinces, and that will spread to other villages, and then to the provincial level, and then to the national level, and that will affect China as well. Today, Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese ruler since Mao Zedong. Democracy has gone in reverse there. So both these fundamental pillars of our policy on China have been wrong. And, when empirical reality overtakes your assumptions, it's best to revise your policy.
Are you concerned that Donald Trump may not step down even if he loses? You talked about a sort of authoritarian bent that he had.
Look, I didn't see any evidence of that. I think if we did see evidence, it would be our collective responsibility to say, don't even think about it. And that's why I think there'll be enough attention on the election. I'd stunned and disappointed in the whole country if the message didn't get through that if we have a clear winner, we ought to just go through with it.
How are you going to spend your time now, Mr. Ambassador? Are you going to be staying in Maryland and trying to get engaged in public policy issues? Are you going to try to work with Yale? What's in, you've got the burden of this book behind you. I know you're promoting it now, but what's your next move?
Well, I certainly give great credit to those like yourself who keep writing books. I've written 2 large books, and they've both been about me, and they were both enormous efforts. And after the first one, I said I was never going to do it again. And after this one, I can safely say I'm never going to do it again. But yeah, public policy has been where I've spent much of my focus in terms of my career. I've referred to the discussion about the future of the Republican Party. I'll do a little bit of money-making activity as well, hopefully. But I think the attraction of public service is trying to steer the country in the right direction, try and, in my case, protect it in the national security space, and it's something I'll keep on doing.
Before we turn to getting questions from people that are writing in, very briefly, a couple people you mentioned in the book, I wanted to get your real gut on who they are and whether they are contributing in a positive or negative way to our democracy. Rudy Giuliani, what do you make of him and how he's been behaving in the Trump administration, truthfully?
Well, I've known Rudy for a long time, going back to Justice Department days in the Reagan administration. I, honest to goodness, don't know fully what he's doing out there for Trump. I came across him in the Ukraine circumstance, and I thought, look, the president's entitled to have his political allies work for him politically. What he's not entitled to do is to manipulate legitimate governmental power around his own political future. And I thought that's what he and Rudy were doing in Ukraine. We still don't know the full extent of what Rudy may be doing today, but it worries me.
And what about Jared Kushner? Is he playing a useful role in the Trump administration? So it's sort of a mysterious, shadowy figure, the way he emerges in and out of Middle Eastern peace efforts and deals with Saudi Arabia and the like. What do you make of his role?
Well, I've been asked who's the second most powerful person in the White House, and I've said, and I believe it's Jared. I never thought very much about anti-nepotism rules before this experience, and this is not a case of favoring your relatives over more qualified people. I think the real lesson in anti-nepotism rules is you can't run an effective organization when some people are just exempt from the rules of the organization. I think Clinton made the same mistake by putting Hillary in charge of healthcare policy in his administration. And I think in all the manifold areas that Jared's been involved in, it's harmed the overall effectiveness of the administration. It may have helped Donald Trump personally because he obviously trusts his judgment, but it didn't help out the government as a whole.
What about Pompeo? You seem to have a unusual relationship with him, to put it mildly. Did he start infuriating you after a while?
Well, I think we came at things, and probably still do, from a very similar philosophical perspective. I think what disappointed me with him was that after a certain period, he just stopped, I think, being as candid with the president as he could have been and should have been, in my view, and as that I and others continued to be. There isn't any doubt who the final decision maker is. It's the president. Nobody misunderstands that. But I think when there comes a point where you're just saluting and saying, okay, I'll carry out what you want in a knee-jerk fashion, I think that's where we parted ways.
Very good. I think we're ready to open it up to some other conversation. Jamie or anybody there? Well, here's one I'm getting from somebody right now. They want to know what is the role of Stephen Miller in with Donald Trump, and how important is Miller to the Trump White House operation?
Well, he's a very important figure. His principal issue, substantively, in fact, almost his only issue, is immigration. I mean, that covers a lot of territory, illegal and legal immigration. It's a great passion of his, and he has a tremendous influence on Trump's views and policy. He is also, in effect, the lead speechwriter. Doesn't have that title formally, but he has crafted some of Trump's most important remarks. And I would say if the remarks that Trump has given from prepared texts that Miller prepared were the actual policies that Trump followed, it would be a very different presidency. But Trump will read Steve Miller's speeches and then put them aside. And that was one thing I learned very, very early. The prepared speeches he does because he has to, because people are saying politically you got to do it, but he doesn't necessarily believe what's in them.
The most powerful chapter in the book is really the one dealing with Ukraine, and it's been covered by the press quite a bit. But I mean, what do you make of Donald Trump's obsession with Hunter Biden? And don't you feel that this should just be out of bounds in American politics, this sort of picking on the son of your rival in this kind of way, and all that occurred in the Ukraine? What's your feeling about Hunter Biden? Do you have animosity towards him? Does he stay in your mind any? Or are you willing just to let that go now that you're a private citizen?
Well, I don't think it should affect people's consideration of voting for Biden. Why he took that board of directors job in Ukraine, I can't tell other than the money. It was a bad decision on his part, bad decision on his father's part to let it go on, but it reflects no corruption at all that I can tell. You know, what Trump wanted to do was use government power to advantage himself politically by attacking Biden, by attacking Hillary Clinton. That's unacceptable. And I have the story in the book. You know, in the 1992 election, Jim Baker was running the campaign and for George H.W. Bush, and it wasn't going well against Clinton, obviously. Ultimately, he lost. But a number of members of Congress came to Bush 41 and Baker and said, look, you got to get Britain to help on the details of what Clinton did when he was in England after college and traveling and so on. And Baker and Bush both said, we're not going to ask for a foreign government to help us in an American election. Forget it. And confronted with the same choice, Trump grasped at the foreign help. And that's a huge mistake, and I think a corruption of our election process.
Now that you are a private citizen, and we've been living in the age of Donald Trump, and you've had this ringside seat, which you in the room where it happened. Title of your book, you got to witness a lot. Out of all of the things that President Trump's done, which disturbed you the most? Which really you looked at it, whether it was something as the Charlottesville, or the way he talks about Confederate monuments, or about his relationship with Russia? What to the core to John Bolton said, boy, that is rotten and that is not right?
Well, I think there's a lot of competition for the one answer to that question. Yeah. The straw that finally led to my resignation was not just the Afghan deal with the Taliban, but the idea he would invite the Taliban to Camp David to sign it. Now, that's not a corruption issue, but in terms of integrity and the strength of American institutions, to bring a bunch of terrorists to Camp David, I was just appalled by that.
And it's was there any on the domestic front that, right now with the Black Lives Matters movement going on in the street protests, how did you interpret when you saw Donald Trump, for example, walk from the White House to the Episcopalian Church in DC that you know well, and have tear gas or substances sprayed on protesters for him to have that Bible moment? What did that tell you about Trump and our democracy at this moment?
Well, it was one more example of how totally cynical he is. People will characterize things he does as racist or other characterizations. I don't think he thinks that deeply about them. I think this is all about Donald Trump, and that in and of itself is corrosive of democracy, because if you're in public service seeking higher office for your own advancement or whatever, nonetheless, you have to have a public purpose. And I don't think that public purpose exists within Donald Trump.
You know, just talking to you, I recall just what a presence you've been in American public policy life. You used to be on Fox News as a commentator a lot. You're really knowledgeable on international affairs issues. Have you thought about getting back into being on television as a commentator if one of CNN or Fox or MSNBC or one of these media outfits would ask you?
Sure, I've thought about it. A lot has been delayed because of the book and the requirements of everything we had to go through, including the pre-publication review and whatnot. But as I finish with activity associated with the book, yeah, I'm definitely going to think about what else to do, whether I want to do that on a daily basis or whether there's some other role as well.
How have you dealt with COVID-19 crisis? Are you a mask wearer? And do you do social distance?
I take this seriously. This is another source of controversy, a reorganization I did on the NSC staff. I thought the reorganization would strengthen our ability to protect against pandemics. I've spent a lot of my professional career on weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The effect of a biological weapons attack looks a lot like what has happened to us with COVID-19. And in fact, the structure I set up actually continued to work. In early January, the NSC staff, the Centers for Disease Control, were all raising red flags about this pandemic. We didn't know a lot because China was covering it up. But the real problem was the empty chair in the Oval Office. The president didn't want to hear bad news about China or Xi Jinping or the effect on the American economy, which was his ticket to re-election. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're still suffering to the extent we are. But from the minute I heard about it, of course, I was out of government by that time, I knew this was something that could be very dangerous. I don't want to pretend I predicted what was going to happen, but I remember the SARS and MERS epidemics from before, and I know biological weapons, and I know what they can do. So I've taken considerable precautions, and there is a multiplicity of policy issues that one can debate about our national reaction, but for people not to take it seriously is a big mistake.
Do you feel that President Trump was wise to use the World Health Organization as a punching bag? Do you want to pull the United States funding from it, or are you a supporter of WHO?
Well, I think the WHO performed very badly in the COVID-19 context. It took China at its word much too long. It didn't really do what it could have done to learn more about what happened inside China. There had been a Chinese citizen as Director General of the WHO for 10 years before the current Director General, so Chinese influence was very considerable. I've dealt with WHO since the Reagan administration in one form or another. In its early years, it had enormous successes internationally in disease control, but in recent years, it's a big, cumbersome bureaucracy. Would it have been the first UN agency I would have withdrawn from in the Trump administration? No. But I think people should take seriously the failures of WHO. You can say, but it's devoted to health. That doesn't mean it's immune from criticism. And frankly, the strongest supporters of the UN institutionally should be its most vigorous critics, and they are not. So that's why others jump in, as in the case of Trump withdrawing.
As a national security advisor, they're thinking in those terms, how is COVID-19 undermining U.S. foreign policy right now? We're the country that's being hit the hardest. Are there other nations taking advantage of us when we're in this crippled state?
Well, I don't think the reaction overall in the West was that great. If you look at mortality per 100,000 of population, we're not disproportionately beyond many of our friends in Europe. They didn't do a great job either. I think the major casualty of the pandemic is to reinforce Trump's desire or his inclination not to look internationally to begin with. So for the last, we'll say, 7 months, there has been a vacuum internationally, not because of WHO failing, but because of the U.S. failing to take leadership. And you don't need a bureaucracy to do effective work. Had the president called an emergency G7 meeting to talk with the other G7 leaders, there are any number of things he could have done to mobilize a more effective international reaction. And, for example, to put more pressure on China to tell us what happened in the early days so that the epidemiologists could adjust their thinking accordingly. It's also meant a vacuum for other things that are going on internationally beyond coronavirus, like China's suppression of Hong Kong. And that's just sort of one in a long list. And when you miss these opportunities, or when things happen that you're not paying attention to, it's hard to get that opportunity back again. So I think overall, we emerge weaker internationally. I think many others emerge weaker as well, and that's not good for international stability going forward, that's for sure.
Oh, we're getting ready to wrap up here, but let me ask you, if you had to pick a success of the Trump administration foreign policy, something that when you look back that it worked and it was smart, what would you put in that category?
Well, I think probably the most significant success was the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal of 2015. This was a deal that was failing to stop the Ayatollah's progress. People said when Trump withdrew, and he tried for 15 months, and he couldn't get his own administration to do it. I came in, and in 30 days, we got it done, which is what he wanted to do. I didn't force it on him. People said, well, U.S. economic sanctions alone aren't going to have any impact on Iran. In fact, our sanctions have brought the country to the brink of chaos. And right now, somebody, and publicly we don't know who it is beginning to blow up pieces of the Iran nuclear program. This was very important to do. The threat of a country like Iran or North Korea with the world's most destructive weapons is frightening to me. I mean, I know what nuclear weapons can do. And pretending that you're solving the problem when you're not doesn't make the U.S. more secure. So this was a big step. We didn't follow through all the ways that we should have, but I think that's probably the most significant.
And the most disappointing to you, is it the Taliban issue, or is there some, what would you consider Trump's biggest foreign policy failure?
Well, I put that in a different category. I just use the word China. I don't think we yet have a strategy to deal with China. I respect the Chinese government, which thinks strategically probably better than any other major power in the world. We barely think strategically at all, and we're having our clock cleaned in many ways because we're not standing up. We'll see what happens after the election, but I think there's a sea change going on in the American population in our views of China. We've seen Huawei trying to take over fifth generation telecommunication. We've seen what they're doing in Hong Kong. We've seen what they've done to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We've seen what they've done to us in cyberspace. This is a very, very dangerous period that we're entering into. And to say, as Trump basically does, we can solve it all with the trade deal is a gross oversimplification. Number one, you're not going to get the kind of trade deal you want from China. And number two, they've already taken steps in many areas that are well beyond the effect of changing the trade relationship. So for Americans going forward for the rest of the century, China should be the main focus of attention.
And it is true, as you've reported, that President Trump did not know that Great Britain had a nuclear capacity.
He didn't know that, and he thought Finland was part of Russia.
All right, those will live forever. Those a couple of nuggets will never be erased from the Trump years. My last question to you is, if Joe Biden were listening right now, or we got a tape of this, and here's your, you are one of the nations, we've invested in you as one of the wise people in American foreign policy. Would you be willing to consult with Joe Biden on U.S. foreign policy issues if he reached out to you?
Well, this will probably ruin both of our reputations, but the answer, of course, is yes. When the president wants somebody's opinion, I think he should receive it. And he may ask for it once and never call back again. But in a more civil era in American politics, that would not even be considered an unusual question.
But you would, if Joe Biden reached out to you, you would have a conversation with them on foreign policy.
Sure, or his top advisors, and they'll make up their own minds. They're all adults.
Okay, great. Well, that's a good answer. And thank you for writing your book, The Room Where It Happened. It's going to be it's major part of our literature of our time. I hope you write another book someday, maybe one that's fun, maybe a biography of Dean Acheson, or a look at John Foster Dulles or other people you've admired in the making of U.S. foreign policy. But I appreciate your service to our country and taking time to speak to the Rancho and Mirage Writers Festival. It's been great, and you were terrific. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, and I enjoyed the discussion very much. I hope it was helpful to those listening in.
All right. You take care of yourself, sir.
Okay, you too. Thank you very much now.
Okay.